On a hot afternoon in Washington, D.C., a black man in plain clothes was walking out of a bookstore near the Pentagon. He looked ordinary, quiet, and uninteresting, until a young FBI officer approached, his eyes alert and suspicious. "Stop! Put your hands up," the officer shouted, pointing his gun at the man. The man froze, raising his hands. He was strangely calm, his eyes calm but piercing. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and firm. The officer replied curtly, "I was told there was a suspicious person in the area." "You fit the description. Where are your papers?" The man sighed, pulling his wallet from his pocket slowly, without showing any sign of anxiety. He opened the wallet and took out a dark blue ID card with the United States Department of Defense logo. The officer glanced at him, then turned pale. "General." Yes, that man was General Benjamin Harris, one of the highest-ranking generals in the U.S. military, who had commanded thousands of soldiers and had served his country for more than 30 years. The officer quickly lowered his gun, stammered an apology, but it was too late. A group of military police had seen the whole thing on camera and immediately appeared. General Harris did not get angry. He just stared at the officer and said one sentence that silenced everyone. "You don't see a citizen, you see skin color." The officer was then temporarily suspended pending an investigation into discrimination. The incident spread quickly, causing a stir. As for General Harris, he refused all interviews, leaving behind a simple message. "I don't want anyone to live in fear of being threatened by the person who protects them." 3 days after the shooting, Agent Daniel Reeves sat motionless in the FBI's Internal Affairs office. The gray concrete walls seemed to close in on him from all sides. The fluorescent lights above flickered slowly, casting a chilling light that seemed to illuminate the lines on his tense face and his unfocused eyes. In front of him was a small screen, which had just turned off after replaying the video that Daniel had watched for the third time, just 23 seconds. But those 23 seconds were the verdict. He couldn't deny what had happened. In the recording, a black man pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, slowly, non-threateningly. Daniel, still stressed from a previous failed manhunt, reacted instinctively. He pulled out a gun. He screamed. He pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed in his mind, louder than the judgments from the press, social media, and internal meetings that were tightening around him like a noose. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. A small voice spoke in his head. At first it was self-justification, but it gradually turned to guilt. Daniel had never thought of himself as a racist. He had grown up in a strict military family, where honor and duty were sacred. He had laughed at the unconscious bias training, dismissing it as a fad. But now, the phrase weighed more heavily on him than any sentence. From outside the closed room, a knock sounded on the door. A supervisor entered, placing a thick file in front of him. "The final assessment will be released tomorrow morning. But I need you to understand one thing, this isn't just about you and the victim. This is about how this organization is perceived. About the public's trust in us. And about how you could become the poster child for what they've been condemning." Daniel raised his head, his eyes widening in their blankness, but not with anger, but with fear. Not just fear of losing his job. Not just fear of being convicted. It was the fear of facing himself, and the terrible truth he had long denied. He had reacted not to danger, but to a fear, one he had never understood. And perhaps, that was the scariest thing of all. Elsewhere, General Harris's own home. The small house at the end of a quiet street, where the shadows of old trees stretched across the sidewalk like an untouched memory. General Harris, now retired, lived alone in that house, a place where there were no gunshots, no orders, but it was never quiet. In the dimly lit kitchen, he carefully poured boiling water into an old porcelain teapot. The strong scent of black tea, the Afghan tea he had brought back from his last tour of duty, came from his brew, a slow ritual he followed, as if preserving something fragile between the past and the present. Since the incident at the base, the incident the press had called him by names he did not want to repeat, he had chosen to remain silent. No defense, no explanation, no appearance on any program that invited him to be the guest of honor. But every night he woke up, at the same time, 3:17 a.m. Not because of a noise, not because of a nightmare. But because something was still stuck in him, like a handful of sand that had not yet been washed away from wounds he had thought had healed. It was not the point of the gun that bothered him the most. It was the look in the young officer's eyes. It was not exactly hate. It was a mixture of fear and a strange understanding. And he knew, that fear was not born of any individual. It was the product of a system all too accustomed to viewing people through the prism of prejudice. A society that preached justice, but whispered in the dark that there were skin colors that could never be harmless. He had seen it for a long time. But for the first time, he felt it, like a scratch in the middle of his chest. That morning, when he opened the door to get the paper, he saw a light brown envelope sitting neatly on the porch. No postmark. No sender's name. No return address. As if it had come from nowhere. He hesitated. His fingers touched the edge of the envelope, feeling the roughness of recycled paper, the smell of fresh ink. Inside, a folded sheet of paper, handwritten in neat but slightly shaky handwriting. There are things that cannot be said in public. But you must know, not all of us are blind. Below the words was a black dot, like a note dropped from an unfinished symphony. General Harris sat down on the steps, the morning sunlight slanting across his shoulders, illuminating the silver hair at his temples. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, he felt his chest no longer heavy. The letter did not change the world. But to him, it was something. A whisper in the silent desert. I am Daniel Reeves. I am the man who pointed a gun at you. Not for justice. Not out of any real threat. But out of a blind fear that has been ingrained in me since before I knew what my name meant. I am not writing to ask for your forgiveness. I know I am not entitled to it. Forgiveness is a gift, and I am not sure I deserve it. I just need you to know, that that moment, when our eyes met, and you said nothing, changed me forever. I had been trained to see danger. But in that moment, I did not see a threat. I saw a man, no, a person, holding a book. A man with calm eyes, not pleading, not fear. Eyes that told me you had seen far worse than I had. And I was afraid. I grew up in a neighborhood where different was viewed with caution. People like me were automatically right. People like you were automatically suspicious. No one said it out loud, there was no need. It was in the way my mother squeezed my hand when someone black walked by. In the way my teachers talked about dangerous neighborhoods. In the harmless jokes around the dinner table. I never asked questions. Until I looked into your eyes. After that day, I couldn't sleep. The clock's hands were louder than the gunshots I'd fired. I started reading, something I'd considered foreign. I talked to people I'd never looked straight into before. I withdrew from the military, refused pay, and spent time untangling what I thought was true. I wasn't sure I was going to be a good person. But I knew I couldn't go on being the same person. If one day you would accept my invitation, just to sit down together, not as officer and suspect, not as two opposing sides, but as two people, sharing a cup of tea and a moment of silence, that would be the greatest gift of my life. Whatever your answer, I am grateful that you survived, and that the look in your eyes saved me from myself. With all the honesty I can muster in one line. Daniel Reeves. General Harris put the letter down. His hand shook slightly. The paper still smelled of gunpowder, as if carrying the echoes of explosions from the distant past. His eyes stopped at the last line, where the scrawled signature of a young soldier, who had stood before him in the ranks, bright eyes and a heart that had never known fear. He said nothing. He stood up quietly, walked through the old wooden door, the creaking of the hinges like a sigh from the old house. The air outside carried the humidity of the late afternoon. He sat down on the familiar wooden chair, the back of which was worn by the years. The cup of tea had gone cold, but he still brought it to his lips, sipping it like a habit that was hard to break. In the sky, the sunset poured fire, burning the clouds into a fiery orange. A light wind blew by, scattering the papers on the table, maps, battle plans, nameless orders. But he did not bother to pick them up. His mind was wandering somewhere beyond the front lines, where there were no bunkers, no grenades or gunshots. Only one sentence echoed in his head. Every war doesn't always require gunfire. There are silent battles, taking place in people's hearts. Where compassion vies with honor, memory collides with reason. Where a soldier's letter can make a general sit silently for hours, just to watch the sun set. And he understood, perhaps the most important battle of his life, was starting from this very moment. Underscore 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 underscore. 3 weeks after the letter was sent, Daniel stood before a large iron gate covered with pale green moss, clutching his faded baseball cap in his hand. A light drizzle fell, and fog hung over the path leading to the quiet house like a translucent curtain hiding all memories. He took a deep breath. The iron gate creaked open without warning. No guards. No servants. Only a voice from the darkness of the silent garden. "Come in. You're standing out there, disturbing the old ghosts." The voice, deep and hoarse, but razor-sharp, sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He stepped inside, his heavy army boots sinking into the damp ground. General Harris was standing in the greenhouse behind him, pruning a bonsai tree with scissors. The pale yellow light from the glass roof highlighted the silver in his hair. He was slightly tilted, his shoulders thin but still holding the air of a man who had once made the entire base hold its breath when he passed by. Daniel stood still, like a recruit before a trial of his conscience. "What are you looking for?" Harris didn't turn around, his voice steady as a scissor cut through the silence. "The truth," Daniel said. "And forgiveness. But, only when I understand what I've really done." Silence. There was only the patter of rain on the glass roof and the clatter of scissors cutting through tiny leaves. General Harris put down the scissors and turned around. His eyes, still deep, still bright, but now the light of long-dead stars, looked straight at Daniel. "The truth?" He stepped forward, each step seeming to carry the echoes of the war years. "What do you want to know, who died, or why you were ordered to pull the trigger?" Daniel swallowed. He had faced bullets and bloody, nameless faces before. But he had never felt as scared as he did now. "I want to know, if I hadn't followed orders that day, would things have been different?" Harris stood still, for a long time. Then he turned back to the bonsai pot as if searching for an answer that time had covered with dust. "You weren't the only one who pulled the trigger, Daniel. But you're the only one alive who dares to ask that question." A flash of lightning lit up the greenhouse like an old photograph turned over. The rain began to pour heavily. Daniel felt as if he had stepped into a memory whose exit had long since rotted. "You didn't just kill one person that day," Harris said slowly. "You killed a path, a choice, a hope. But no one told you that, because we needed someone who believed they were right." Daniel shuddered. His voice broke. "So. I'm just a pawn." "No," Harris looked straight at him. "You're a soldier. And a soldier, when he stops wondering why, becomes a tool." Silence fell again. But this time, it was not the silence of confusion, but of the truth being revealed, cold, naked. Daniel sat down on the stone bench in the greenhouse, and for the first time, his hands trembled not from fear, but from belated understanding. "Now you know," Harris said, turning back to the small potted plant. The question is, what are you going to do with it? General Harris carefully placed the pruning shears on the wooden table, his hands sticky with resin from the bonsai branch he had just cut. He held out his right arm, palm up, pointing to a long scar, thin as a blade, hidden under the skin stained by time. "I got this scar when I was 17, he said, his voice even as if he were telling a small story, but his eyes were not. "A police officer hit me on the wrist with a baton because he thought I had stolen a car. No questions asked. No proof. It was my father's car. I was in the hospital for a week." The policeman? Still on the job. Still decorated. Daniel stood still. He wanted to say something, but a rock was blocking his throat. General Harris raised his hand to his left shoulder. This, he touched a hollow beneath his shirt, was from enemy fire. Iraq. I was wounded, blood was dripping down my sleeve. But I stood up and led my men into battle for the next 36 hours. No one was left behind. No one died under my command that day. He paused, took a deep breath, as if summoning the strength of old age to say what he said next. When he looked up, his eyes that had seen war, death, and tested loyalties, saw Daniel. "But the deepest wound," he said, his voice slow and steady, as if each word weighed more than air, "was when I, a 4-star general in the United States Army, had a gun pointed at my head by a young policeman in broad daylight. For no reason. Without warning. Just because I was standing next to a car that wasn't running properly. On the very ground I bled to protect." Daniel looked up at him, his lips pressed together. "I didn't see a gun that day," he continued, "I saw a system. A legalized prejudice. An unspoken message, whoever you are a suspicious black man." The air was thick. There was only the sound of the wind in the tiny bonsai trees, as fragile as the soul of the unspoken. Daniel bowed his head. There was no rain on his face. Only hot drops of something running down his cheeks. No one said the word tears, but it was there, clear, unacknowledged. "Sir," his voice trembled, "what do you think I should do?" General Harris was silent for a moment. A silence that was not threatening, but heavy as stone. "Take this moment," he said, softly but firmly. "Hold on to that naked feeling, that moment when you're forced to look at yourself, without the badge, without the power, just the real you. Because when you walk down the street with that badge, every eye that looks at you is an opportunity. An opportunity to heal or to wound. You can make someone believe, or scare them for life, in a single glance." He turned away, picking up the pruning shears. The small bonsai pots lined up silently before him, silent witnesses. "I don't need apologies, Daniel. I need people like you to be worthy of the scars that others have borne. My name is Frank Delgado. Ex-Special Forces. Long-Range Reconnaissance. And Benjamin Harris's battle buddy, his comrade in arms for more than a decade in the military. I've cursed him out in the middle of battle. I've yelled at him in the middle of a helipad, amid the sound of artillery, amid the smell of blood and gunpowder. There was a time when we almost came to blows, fists instead of words, over what I thought was a stupid order. In the Kandahar desert, when the heat of the day can burn away all reason, differences in thinking can turn into hostility. And we were close to that border. But then, I also stood there dumbfounded as he did something that not everyone in a military uniform would dare to do." Daniel didn't answer. His face softened, but his eyes seemed to be wrestling with something deep inside. "I want to do something useful, Mr. Frank," he finally said. His voice was low, but firm. "I can't erase the past. But I can help others avoid the path I took. I owe it to them. And to myself." I nodded. Part of me wanted to pull him into a tight hug, like a child who had survived a flood. Another part, older and more tired, just sighed silently. From that day on, Daniel turned down the invitation to return to the FBI. He was no longer the agent chasing criminals through alleys. Now he was an instructor, teaching ethics at police academies across the country. No stage. No cameras. Just small classes, real stories, and the eyes of students listening. They called him, the officer who owned his bullet, the officer who was brave enough to face a bullet that had not yet been fired. And braver enough to choose to live his life to bear its meaning. And Harris? He still tended bonsai in the backyard. Still as silent as the pine branches he trimmed every day. But one day, he sent me a message, so short that I thought I had misread it. He chose the right mission. Not because of me. But because he understood, his mistakes are not the end, but the beginning. I was a soldier. I did not easily believe in redemption. The battlefield taught me that when people are broken, they are often broken forever. But sometimes, there are people who not only get up, but also return to the old path, to light it for others. Daniel was one of them. Underscore 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 underscore. The U.S. Capitol Building, Washington, D.C. A heavy Wednesday morning, gray clouds covered the Capitol. Inside the domed hall, the air was thick with tension. National television cameras were on, millions of eyes were watching. This was no longer a hearing, it was a battle between two worldviews, between memory and prejudice, between truth and stagnant institutions. Reforming the law enforcement training system, the issue of racism and the reflex to violence. On the witness stand, 3 people, 3 fates, 3 perspectives cannot be reconciled. General Benjamin Harris, a retired black general, once a symbol of reconciliation, now a living testament to an unhealed wound after the incident of having a gun pointed at his head just because his skin was not white. Daniel Reeves, a former FBI agent, who pulled the trigger but luckily did not kill anyone. Now a police ethics trainer, a man trying to fix the past with his own lessons. Director Hank Ellison, who used to lead Daniel, a cold, pragmatic former commander, stood up against all proposals for emotional reform, as he called it. Underscore 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 underscore. General Harris stood up. No papers. No projection screen. Just a naked voice. I served this country for 35 years. I wore a uniform when others wore school uniforms. I held the flag when my comrades lay dead. But one day, in a small alley, I was held at gunpoint by another soldier of my country, because he found me suspicious. Because I wasn't white. He paused. Not to catch his breath, but for a moment of silence. A moment of truth. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid that if I fell, no one would be surprised. Because it was too familiar. The room held its breath. The camera zoomed in on his face, not angry, not weak, just the calm of someone who has overcome pain to the point where it has become a constant companion. Underscore 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 underscore. When it was Daniel Reeves' turn, he didn't look at Harris. He looked down at his hands. I did it. No one had to remind me. I remember every detail. I believed that quick reflexes were my lifeline. But no one taught me that those reflexes were programmed wrongly, by fear, by prejudice, by the system. Reforming the law enforcement training system, the issue of racism and the reflex to violence. On the witness stand, 3 people, 3 fates, 3 perspectives cannot be reconciled. General Benjamin Harris, a retired black general, once a symbol of reconciliation, now a living testament to an unhealed wound after the incident of having a gun pointed at his head just because his skin was not white. Daniel Reeves, a former FBI agent, who pulled the trigger but luckily did not kill anyone. Now a police ethics trainer, a man trying to fix the past with his own lessons. Director Hank Ellison, who used to lead Daniel, a cold, pragmatic former commander, stood up against all proposals for emotional reform, as he called it. Underscore 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 underscore. General Harris stood up. No papers. No projection screen. Just a naked voice. I served this country for 35 years. I wore a uniform when others wore school uniforms. I held the flag when my comrades lay dead. But one day, in a small alley, I was held at gunpoint by another soldier of my country, because he found me suspicious. Because I wasn't white. He paused. Not to catch his breath, but for a moment of silence. A moment of truth. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid that if I fell, no one would be surprised. Because it was too familiar. The room held its breath. The camera zoomed in on his face, not angry, not weak, just the calm of someone who has overcome pain to the point where it has become a constant companion. Underscore 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 underscore. When it was Daniel Reeves' turn, he didn't look at Harris. He looked down at his hands. I did it. No one had to remind me. I remember every detail. I believed that quick reflexes were my lifeline. But no one taught me that those reflexes were programmed wrongly, by fear, by prejudice, by the system. Reforming the law enforcement training system, the issue of racism and the reflex to violence. On the witness stand, 3 people, 3 fates, 3 perspectives cannot be reconciled. General Benjamin Harris, a retired black general, once a symbol of reconciliation, now a living testament to an unhealed wound after the incident of having a gun pointed at his head just because his skin was not white. Daniel Reeves, a former FBI agent, who pulled the trigger but luckily did not kill anyone. Now a police ethics trainer, a man trying to fix the past with his own lessons. Director Hank Ellison, who used to lead Daniel, a cold, pragmatic former commander, stood up against all proposals for emotional reform, as he called it. General Harris stood up. No papers. No projection screen. Just a naked voice. I served this country for 35 years. I wore a uniform when others wore school uniforms. I held the flag when my comrades lay dead. But one day, in a small alley, I was held at gunpoint by another soldier of my country, because he found me suspicious. Because I wasn't white. He paused. Not to catch his breath, but for a moment of silence. A moment of truth. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid that if I fell, no one would be surprised. Because it was too familiar. The room held its breath. The camera zoomed in on his face, not angry, not weak, just the calm of someone who has overcome pain to the point where it has become a constant companion. When Daniel Reeves's turn came, he didn't look at Harris. He looked down at his hands. I did it. No one had to remind me. I remember every detail. I believed that quick reflexes were my lifeline. But no one taught me that those reflexes were programmed wrongly, by fear, by prejudice, by the system. He looked up. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking to do it again. With each new student, I try to plant in them the question I never dared to ask: who is this person in front of me, who is it? Or am I just seeing what I've been taught to fear? Director Ellison crossed his arms. He stepped to the podium as if he were entering a military meeting. His voice was firm, his contempt unmistakable. We live in a time when emotion trumps reason. Police officers are not trained to read emotion. They are trained to survive. Every second of hesitation is a bullet through their heads. He turned to look directly at Harris and Reeves. We can't reform our forces by repentance. We have to teach them to do right, not to feel right. A young congresswoman sat at the questioning table, sighing silently. Her fingers tapped the tabletop, in no particular rhythm. On one side was pain. On the other was fear. And in the middle was a system too old to be shaken by mere statements. The television headline read: General Harris, freedom and racism cannot coexist. But how many people would watch the entire hearing? How many will remember? And how many will believe change is real? 3 months after the hearing. It was autumn, leaves were falling all over the porch of the small house in the suburbs of Arlington. Daniel visited General Harris. No cameras. No press. No speech. Just a meeting between two men, who had been on opposite sides of a gun barrel. General Harris was sitting pruning an old bonsai tree. His hands were still shaking slightly. The wind blew through the crack in the door, carrying the scent of wood and tea. Daniel stood still for a moment before speaking. That day. I thought you would hate me forever. Harris did not raise his head. He only said, you want me to hate you so you don't have to forgive yourself? Daniel was silent. The question pierced right through his rational armor. I used to think, if I corrected enough mistakes, if I taught enough others, I would be at peace. Daniel said, his voice soft as if he were afraid he would hear it. But now, every time I sleep, I still dream of you raising your hand, and I don't stop. General Harris raised his head. There was something in his eyes that was no longer the gaze of a general, but of a father, a teacher, someone who had lived too long in the same dreams. I have nights like that too. But in my dreams, I can't stop a soldier from killing a child. The two sat there, in silence, as if their nightmares were speaking for them. Then General Harris poured tea. He said, softly but clearly, you don't need forgiveness. You need to move on. Continue to do what? Daniel asked. Continue to remember. But don't let yourself be swallowed up. Daniel left the house before dusk. On the table, Mr. Harris left a small, carefully trimmed bonsai branch, the leaves just beginning to turn a brilliant orange red. A card was clipped to it. A scar is not just a reminder of pain. It is proof that you are alive, that you can heal, for yourself, and for others. The following year, Daniel launched a new program, Second Trigger, a training course that focused on the second response, the pause he had never had. Many young officers attended. Some laughed. But some cried in class, admitting for the first time that they had seen the enemy in the faces of innocent people. And on another fall day, after class ended, Daniel walked down the hall and saw a young officer standing alone, crying. He simply put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said, I was in your place. The story doesn't end there. It never really ends. Because the fight to be human, kind, calm, humane, never ends. Only those who dare to turn back, step into their own darkness, to lead others out of it. That winter, a light snow fell on Constitution Avenue. The bare branches stood silently under the silver-gray sky, like arms reaching up, not to surrender, but to embrace the light. Daniel stood before the small memorial, engraved with the names of those who had fallen in internal strife, not in war, but in the mistakes of the very people who were supposed to protect them. He did not bring his speech. He only placed his hand on the stone, letting his cold hand touch the familiar name, Michael Trayton, the 16-year-old boy who had been shot because he was mistakenly thought to be pulling a gun. In his hand was a phone. Daniel whispered. "I never knew you. But I was a gunman." In the distance, General Harris sat on a bench, wearing a thick coat, his eyes following Daniel. He knew that every step Daniel took today was a step the system had never prepared him for. A system that teaches how to aim quickly, but not how to really see. That afternoon, the two men walked side by side along the Potomac River. Neither spoke much. The wind was cold, but something warmed between them, not from forgiveness, but from a deep understanding of each other. As they parted at the fork in the road, Daniel asked one last question. "Do you think we'll ever teach people to stop pulling the trigger, before they learn to shoot accurately?" General Harris chuckled, his voice hoarse. "We've never taught people to breathe before they pull the trigger. Maybe it's time." That night, snow covered the Capitol Square. But on the desk of a young congressman, the second trigger bill was signed into law for initial debate in the Senate. It would be opposed. It would be delayed. But it would exist. And for the first time in years, America would ask questions before it drew its guns. The story wasn't just about Daniel. Or General Harris. It's about us. About whether, one day, when faced with what we fear, we can learn to look deeper, pause for a second, and choose not to pull the trigger, whether with a gun, with words, or with prejudice. Justice does not begin in a courtroom. It begins the moment we look at another person, and see ourselves in their eyes. The inscription on the new plaque erected after the hearing. No name. Just a reminder.